And now with this module, we're going to talk about compensation plans. So after you attended the last session, our introductory module, that was an overview of the Sales Performance Management Suite to give you an idea as to what the larger story, the larger capabilities of incentive compensation and by default sales performance management can provide. This next module, this is Module 2, and it is entitled Compensation Plans. And so what we're going to do here is walk through the heart of incentive compensation, which is the rules engine. And so in order to illustrate what a compensation plan is, let's start a little bit by giving an overview. And to help give context, because many people that implement incentive compensation programs are not necessarily on comp plans themselves. So let's look at this sample compensation plan. And it's a sample compensation plan for someone that is a U.S. account executive. And so the first thing as we start evaluating this plan, we can see their pay mix. And so of the pay mix, we can see that they have a base salary and then they have a variable component. And that's broken into 60% of their on-target earnings is their base, and then 40% is incentive. And so the way that we talk about this in the incentive compensation world would be that we would say that they're on a 60-40 plan. So a 60-40 plan where 60% of it is base and then 40% of it may be a variable piece. When we drill into the variable component, which is the section down here, we can see that there's a number of aspects that come into this. So we can see that they're, for this account executive, we can see that they have a product commission component, and we can see that they have a service bonus component. We can see that of that 40% of that $100,000 that's listed above, we can see that there's an 80-20 split to that. So 80% of the at target should be made on commissions, 20% might be on bonus. So again, the account executive in totality is on a 60-40 plan, 60% base, 40% incentive, and then that 40% incentive of part of their on-target earning is broken into, and 80% of that is coming from their product commissions, 20% is coming from their services bonus. If we drill into product commissions specifically, let's just look down the column for this guy. So for product commissions, we see the thing that we're measuring him based on is based on product license revenue. So based on how much money or how much revenue he or she brings in, that's going to be what's measured in order to drive commissions. We can see that the performance period for this is a monthly. So this is something that we're assessing the performance over the course of a month, and then we're going to do calculations based on those attainments. Underneath that, we can see a basic rate table. What this is saying is, look, if you make somewhere between $1,000 and $5,000 of product revenue, we're going to give you 1% of that deal. But then when your revenues are between, say, $5,000 and $10,000, then you're going to double your percentage amount and get 2% commission rate for that revenue. And then possibly anything over $10,000 is paid at a commission rate of, say, 3%. And the way that we calculate this is that we're going to take this rate amount, the 1%, 2%, or 3%. We're going to take that rate amount in our incentive formula line, and we're going to multiply that by the revenue. So if someone made, say, $7,000, it might be the $7,000 times 2%, and that might actually be what the person's paid out. On the other column is the service bonus. The service bonus, so this service bonus is let's assume it's based on the consulting and services quota attainment. So it's a percentage of the revenue that's brought in for services and consulting money divided by some quota. That's what a quota attainment percentage means. This is something we can see here that the performance period is quarterly. We can see that there's a rate table associated to this guy, where if they're at 70% of their quota attainment, they might get a flat $15,000 payment. If they're at 100% of it, they might get $30,000. And then if they're at, say, 140%, they might get $50,000. And then this is a bonus component. And so what we're going to do is the calculation for this formula is just whatever the rate is, wherever we fall within the spectrum, just pay that flat amount. And then the avenue that we're brought out is quarterly. This is an example of an infinite number of compensation plans that could be produced by a customer, but this is just, again, one example to help give an idea of what a compensation plan might look like from someone that is being given a compensation plan to see how it's being communicated to them. In order to design a compensation plan, it's based on a series of building blocks. And one of the things we often say is that all that a compensation plan is with Oracle, all that it is, it's an umbrella. And it's an umbrella of these things that we call plan components. So in the example we saw a minute ago, there's a plan component for their monthly commissions, and there's a plan component for their service bonus. So all that a comp plan is, it's an umbrella. And it's an umbrella that allows us to collect together and bring together these discrete things that we call plan components. And it's by assembling it in whatever order we need to is what gives Oracle a lot of the flexibility of the solution. So again, all that a comp plan is, it's an umbrella of these things we call plan components. And in order to build anything in the system, you really have to answer just 3 questions. And those 3 questions are the what, the how, and the how much. So the what is that eligible event or activity that's going to trigger something to happen? Is it selling a particular product? Is it selling into a particular industry? Is it getting an exceeds expectations on my performance review? It's literally anything. It's what is that eligible event or activity that's going to trigger something to happen? That's the what, and that's what we call the performance measure. The how is the math going to be calculated? Am I going to take this variable from the order booking system and multiply it by some variable from the invoicing system and then multiply it by the rate table lookup that we talked about a second ago? So how is that math calculated? And then the how much is how much or at what rate am I going to pay someone? Is it the first threshold, they're going to be paid at a rate of 1%, and then when they get to a next threshold, they get a rate of 2% and on and on. Or maybe it's there's a gate that says anything under 75%, they don't get anything. And then once they hit the 75% threshold, then they're eligible for attainments. So again, all that a compensation plan is, it's an umbrella. And it's an umbrella of these things that we call plan components. And in order to build any plan component or to build anything in the system, you have to answer 3 questions. And those 3 questions are the what, the how, and the how much. The what is what's the eligible event or activity that's going to trigger something to happen. The how is the math calculated. And then the how much is how much or at what rate am I going to pay someone. So let's talk a little bit about plan components. So the first thing to determine, so the plan components are right underneath the umbrella. And so the first question we ask ourselves is, how are we going to calculate the incentive? And the 2 choices we have for a plan component are we're going to calculate per event or we're going to calculate per interval. And so let me give you an example. If you were part of the live classes that we teach, oftentimes I will bring a bag of candy. And let's say that I want to motivate you to ask questions. And so for every question you're going to ask me, I'm going to give you a piece of candy. So let's say I say, are there any questions? And someone raises their hand and says, yeah, I have a question about X. And I say, that's a great question. Here's a piece of candy. Then they ask another question. I say, another great question. Let me give you another piece of candy. Another question, another piece of candy. That's what we call per event. Each time you do something, I'm going to give you a piece of candy. Now, the other option is per interval. Let's say you are in the very back of the room and I say, you know what, that's a great question. Thank you for asking me that question. I have a little bucket right here and I'm going to put your piece of candy here. And then you ask another question throughout the day. I say, great question again. Let me put it in a bucket, and then on. And I accrue this bucket. And I accrue this bucket at the end of the day with all this candy for you. And at the end of the day, I walk over to your desk and I dump the contents of the bucket onto your desk. And so at the end of the interval, and only at the end of the day, or on the end of the month or the end of the quarter, is we dump all the contents out and then we do something with it. Maybe we're going to count the number of pieces of candy you've got. Maybe we're going to sum the number of calories in all the pieces together. But that's per interval. So per event is ask a question, get a piece of candy, ask a question, get a piece of candy. Where per interval is ask a question, I put it in a bucket, ask a question, put it in a bucket, and at the end of the interval, I evaluate all those things together at the same time. So when designing a plan component, the first question we're going to ask is it per event or is it per interval? Another thing a plan component is going to ask us is, what's the type of element are we building? Are we building, is it a bonus? Is it a commission? Is it a SPIF, a sales performance incentive fund? Is it like, what is the motivation and what is the type of thing? Typically, this is a list of values that is used primarily for reporting purposes, but another option when we're designing plan components. Once we design the plan component, then let's talk about the what's, the how's, and the how much's. So let's talk first about the what. What is that eligible event or activity that's going to trigger something to happen? And that's something that we call the performance measure. So if I drill into the performance measure, if we talk a little bit about what the performance measure is, the performance measure, this is basically our accumulation bucket, or this is our attainment bucket. This is where we're measuring the performance based on whatever the compensation plan is going to be driven toward. It can be driven toward revenue numbers. It can be driven toward organizational objectives. It's any eligible event or activity can trigger something to happen. So in the examples listed here, it might be the measuring license revenues. If you're a software company, you want to measure the number of licenses coming in. It might be a ratio or a percent of quota attainment towards your service revenue goals, like we had in the bonus example on the top of this module. We might be measuring people based on the number of new large accounts. Maybe we're doing something for a call center and we want to incent them or drive their behaviors based on the customer satisfaction ratings. When you're done with a call, they say press 1 to complete our customer satisfaction survey, and maybe the performance on that is driving something. It's any eligible event or activity. Anything can be the basis of a performance measure. If we drill into a performance measure, there are 4 components that make up a performance measure. There's what we call the goal, which is synonymous to a target, and many people will call it a quota. But there's the concept of a goal. There's something called a credit category. There's something called a measure formula and a scorecard. And we're going to drill into each of these individually. So let's talk a little bit about the goal. So the goal is, how am I going to be measured for this performance measure? Is it something, am I doing it based on the revenue that's being brought in? Am I doing it by a number of units or number of products? Do I have different goals by product? In the examples here, maybe I'm a inside salesperson or maybe a call center person, and I want to be measured based on the number of calls per day. Or maybe I'm part of a demand gen team and I want to measure people based on the number of new leads that are generated. So what is that metric that I'm going to be measuring people against? And that's something that we call the goal. So as an example, in the application here, I can see this is just a version of the UI, and I can see, okay, so within this performance measure, in order to design anything in the system, and when we get into the application later, you'll see this, everything's wizard driven and we follow trains. So we're creating a performance measure right now, and when we create a performance measure, it's walking us through these individual things of what is the goal and the credit categories and the measure and the scorecard, like we talked about earlier. So inside the application, let's say that there's a total goal. Let's say we're doing this based on revenue. So there's a total goal of, say, 120,000. And that 120,000 might be, say, the annual number, but in this example here, we might be drilling into quarters. So we might evenly distribute it and say, okay, we have an annual goal of 120,000, and that's broken into quarterly goals of, say, $30,000 each. So we've evenly distributed it. Another example, this is a similar view of 120,000, but instead of doing it based on a quarterly view, we might be doing it based on a monthly view, where each month for $120,000, we're evenly distributing it by $10,000 a month. One of the things that's very, very common across industries, in high tech, in life sciences, retail particularly, is the concept of seasonality. I'm sure many of you are aware of retail organizations that make 80% of their revenues, their annual revenues, in the last 2 months of the year. So seasonality is something that's taken into account as well. And so what we might have is within a certain period, there might be seasonal elements to that, where maybe in their Q1, they only expect to get 10% of their annual revenues, where in their Q2, they might get 20%, and on and on. So breaking down the goal, there's a lot of flexibility to this, whether it be dividing it goals by month. You can certainly do by week. You can do by quarter. We have some organizations that do it by day. if you have daily metrics, as well as leveraging seasonality. And then you can leverage other parts of sales performance management, specifically quota planning and quota modeling, if you need tools to do modeling and optimization to say what those targets should be. And then those are then directly fed into the goal components within the performance measure within incentive compensation. The next thing is, so once we've identified the goal, the next thing is the credit category. And what are the things that the credit receiver or the person on the compensation plan can receive compensation? Just because I sell something doesn't necessarily mean that that transaction is going to be picked up and is eligible for compensation. And the way that we connect the type of transaction or the type of element that's of record that's been sold and how we measure that against the eligibility of the person is something that we call credit categories. So in a nutshell, credit categories can be anything. They're anything, they're business defined. It's not IT and it's not a sub list within the application. It's any sales operations or any business user can create those categories of things that are then going to be used to classify a transaction and use that for compensation purposes. And the connection, as I mentioned a second ago, the connection between the list of transactions that are in the queue for a recipient, when I layer that with the eligibility, the way that I understand who's eligible for what and which transactions are going to trigger which compensation components is all measured through the credit categories. These can be by revenue, these can be by units sold, they can be made by any unit of measure that you want. And so as an example, let's pretend that as Oracle, we sell CX or CRM applications along with ERP applications, etc. And let's say that you are part of a CRM selling organization. And so you have a compensation plan where your performance measure has a credit category that says any product that's classified as a CRM application is something that you get credit for. So if we look at the credit category hierarchy, we might have somewhere at a parent level, we might have the Fusion applications. One of its children is CRM. We may have additional children that might be HCM or financials or supply chain, etc. So we have a parent that's Fusion, say the Fusion applications, and then one of its children is CRM. And then let's say CRM in and of itself has a number of children. Maybe incentive compensation is a child of CRM. Maybe Salesforce automation is a child. This is just an example. So you as a salesperson are on a compensation plan with a credit category that says CRM. So let's say a transaction comes in. Let's say transaction number 1 comes in and it's classified during the calculation process with a product type called CRM. Well, because the transaction says CRM, and also because the compensation plan or the credit category on your performance measure says CRM, that's what we call a direct match. Because your comp plan says CRM and the transaction says CRM, that's a direct match. So you get credit for that. Another transaction comes in, and let's say that the product sold on the second transaction is incentive compensation. Well, because the product is incentive compensation, you're tied to CRM. So it's not a direct match, but incentive compensation is a child of CRM. And what we do as part of the classification process is we work from the bottom up. And so because incentive compensation is a child of CRM, you get credit because through inheritance. So you get credit, and so this is a transaction you'll be eligible for. Then let's say a third transaction comes in and the product that's sold on it is Fusion Financials. Well, even though your classification of CRM falls within the Fusion family, Financials does not fall within CRM. It would be considered, let's say, a sibling of CRM somewhere out here to the right. So because of that, it would be no match. And so even though your name might be stamped on the transaction that says, whatever your name is, you received credit for selling Fusion Financials, in reality, you don't get credit because it's not aligned with your compensation plan. So again, this is how credit categories are the trigger that map together what is on the transaction with what's going to be associated or credited to the individual for calculation purposes. Now, from within the application, any business user can create a new credit category. So let's say you run an organization where you sell widgets and gadgets and gizmos. And let's say you're releasing a new line of products that you're going to call doohickeys. And so, and let's say doohickey doesn't exist in the application. So from the administration UI, or when you're designing the compensation plan itself, you can go in and create a new credit category for doohickeys. What you're going to do is you're going to create the credit category itself, which is you're going to create a credit category and just call it doohickey. And then you're going to create a classification rule, which says whenever the product code equals this SKU number or this SKU number or this SKU number, any of those 3 SKU numbers from your product catalog may equal a doohickey. And so that is going to be the calculation for that. And then the last step you do is once you've created these elements, you then are just going to click a button to deploy the rules, and then they'll be replicated and available for any compensation plan. And we'll go into this a little bit more when we get into the labs later, but that's just the steps of creating new credit categories. And it's something that is expected to be performed by the business. It's not an IT operation. And so that's credit categories. So again, within a performance measure, the goal is the target, or is the quota, a lot of people say. It's the thing that we're measuring people against. And the credit category is the connection that says for a particular compensation plan, it's these types of transactions or these types of events or these types of activities that are going to trigger a compensation event. That's the credit category. Another element of the performance measure is the measure formula itself. So now that I've collected these transactions, I might at the measure level want to say I want to do something with it. Because what we're doing is we're collecting raw data. And the raw data is for example, when I talked about putting the pieces of candy in the bucket. Well, all you know is that there's now multiple pieces of candy in a bucket, but then you have to tell the system, well, what do you want to do with it? Do I want to count the number of pieces, like as here in the second example, count the number of units sold? Maybe I want to sum the number of calories or sum the energy or something like that. Or maybe I want to take the total number of pieces of candy divided by maybe I had a quota for you to have candy. So this is where you can do some levels of calculations at the measure level. You can do those as well when we get to the plan component and talk more about the incentive formula. But there is calculation capabilities within the measure formula as well. And then last but not least within the measure is the scorecard. And the scorecard is a lookup table. It's like a rate table, but it's a rate table specifically at the measure level. And we're going to talk more in detail about rate tables in a couple minutes, but maybe I want to do some type of dynamic lookup while I'm calculating the attainment before I present it to the plan component itself. Because again, we're still in the what of the what, how, and how much to define this. And so you have the ability to create scorecards in the what or in the performance measure. They are optional, so you certainly do not have to have scorecards at the measure level. But when you need them, they come in very, very handy. So it's another option that's available for you. And then so that, in essence, is a performance measure. It's broken into 4 components of the goal, the credit category, the measure formula, and the scorecard. And it's by identifying and understanding each of these things allows you to have complete flexibility to build any type of attainment or any type of accrual bucket that you want to. So again, all that a compensation plan is, it's an umbrella. And it's an umbrella of these things that we call plan components. And in order to build anything in the system, you have to answer 3 questions. It's the what, the how, and the how much. The what is what's that eligible event or activity, and we just talked about that. It's broken into goals, credit categories, measure formulas, and scorecards, and those are all tools to help you define the what of what's that eligible event or activity. The how is the math calculated, and then the how much is how much or at what rate am I going to be paying someone. So to investigate those, let's talk a little bit about the incentive formulas and the rate tables. So formulas, this is the how. How is the math going to be calculated? I'm going to take some variable and divide it by another variable and then do something with it. So the incentive formula is the expression that calculates the earnings and the commission. And the way that I think about this, at the measure level, we had a measure formula. And the measure formula was used to calculate the attainments. But once I have the attainments, I then need the ability later to calculate what the earnings or the commissions are going to be. And that's what's happening at the incentive formula level. And so within the formula are these concepts called expressions. And part of incentive compensation, and when we get into the application, you'll see this for yourselves, is that we provide something that we call the expression builder. It's a drag and drop interface that allows us to build any type of calculation based on any field within the data model. And it gives us a lot of flexibility to do a lot of very sophisticated calculations in advanced mathematics. And so this is a preview of what the expression builder looks like. It's fairly unassuming in nature, where you would name whatever the expression is going to be. You could give it a description, and there's this little gray area right here. And this gray area, think of it like a notepad. And what happens in the notepad is entirely up to you. On the right-hand side is you can see a series of attributes. And it looks somewhat unassuming, but when I drill or click the arrow down, what it presents to us is a window into the database. And it allows us to pull attributes or advanced calculations based on a myriad of things that are available to us based on the data model that underlies incentive compensation. We might bring in information directly off some of the attributes collected from the transactions, or maybe attributes stored at the participant level, maybe based on their job level or based on their salary amount. So it really is this window into the database that allows us to do some really complex mathematical calculations. And that's all done through the expression builder when we're configuring the expressions. Another element of this, of designing a compensation plan, is this concept of rate tables. And so the first thing I'll note is that rate tables are optional. So you do not need to have lookup tables or rate tables, but when you do need to have a rate table, they do have to have an input expression. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So let's look in the center of the screen, let's look at this rate table. So I have a basic rate table that says for sales achievement. So let's say in this table, there's between $0 and $10,000, $10,000 and $30,000, and $30,000 and above. There are tiers there. And so between $0 and $10,000, that's going to pay out a rate of, say, 5%. $10,000 to $30,000, that's going to pay out at a rate of, say, 10%, and then anything above that's going to be 15%. That's what we call a rate table. Now, what happens, though, is if we're going to use a rate table, I'm going to get back to the input expression now. If we're going to use a rate table, we need to tell the system, this is the field from the transaction or the field from the database that we're going to be feeding into this. So, for example, if I have a rate table that says sales achievement between $0 and $10,000, $10,000 to $30,000, etc., then I need to feed something to that. So I'm going to take the transaction amount or the total sales amount or my credited amount and tell the system, take the credited amount field and feed that into the rate table. Similarly, if it was number of units sold, I might have been feeding the quantity field and bringing that in. So that's the input expression into the rate table. So we talked a minute ago about a rate table itself. And so this was the example. So between 0 and 10,000, 10,000 and 30,000, and 30,000 above, there's rates of 5, 10, and 15%. This is what we call a one-dimensional rate table, because it's just we're measuring against the attainment or the transaction amount. If we layer on top of that maybe a second dimension, so maybe I want to measure not only the transaction amount of the 0 to 10,000, 10,000 to 30, and 30,000 and above, maybe I also want to take into account the sales margin. Maybe if it's between 0 and 10%, 10% and 20%, 20 to 30, and say 30 and above. And so what we've done here is we've created this matrix, or what we call now a two-dimensional rate table. And the ability of Oracle Incentive Compensation is that you can have an infinite number of dimensions potentially to support multiple dimension lookups. So if I was to look at this in Excel, which is the tool that many people use that they're coming off of when they start to automate this process, if I was to look in Excel and I was to create something that says, okay, if the rate is between greater than 10,000 and less than 30,000, and if the margin is greater than 10,000 and less than 20,000, then give a rate of 3%. To do all of that in Excel, that's nesting of case statements, and it can get very, very long to do something very easy. And so what we provide is this really simple user interface to manage these multiple dimensions from a single place, again, so the business can manage and administer these plan rules. So when we talk about rate dimensions themselves, there's a lot of ways to look at this. And if we start at the top left, one of the ways we can define a rate dimension is something that we call amounts. And so amounts, the example here is units sold. So maybe between 1 and 250 units, we're going to pay out at one rate, 250 to 500 units, pay out at another rate, and 500 and more units pay out at a third rate. So that's an amount, right? That's number of units, or in the example of the 0 to 10,000, 10,000 to 20,000. That's all leveraging an amount type of rate dimension. Below that is the percent. So instead of doing an amount, you can do a percent. 0 to 25% of a quota might be paid out, in this example, might be paid out at one rate, 25 to 75, 75 and above. I often say, what's the difference between an amount and a percent? And the answer is 2 decimal points, right? But percent is another type of dimension that you can be doing. So it might be a percentage of margin, percent of quota, etc. There's a lot of times we would do percentages. A third type of rate dimension that we support is something that we call expressions. So let's say, for example, you have one rep that has a $2 million quota, and you might want to do 0 to 25% of their quota. So you might actually want to write out 0 to $500,000. And then the next one between 25 and 75 of a $2 million quota might be, say, 500,000 to 1.5 million. And then anything above 1.5 million would be paid at a higher rate. So, but let's say you have another rep that has a $4 million quota, and their quota, 25% of their quota would be $1 million. And you don't want to hard code those numbers in. So what expressions allow you to do is allows you to dynamically put math into the tiers so that you can do calculations. So everyone's values are going to be different based on attributes associated either to their plan or to themselves. And so that's an expression type of rate dimension. And then the fourth type of rate dimension is something that we call strings. And so these are alphanumeric. So frequently it's something like, well, if I sell something in the US, I might get a 5% rate. If the deal is transacted in Japan or has a ship to address that goes to Japan, maybe it's a 4%. And if it's in Germany, maybe it's a 7%. Maybe I might want to do a product matrix where if it's my widgets gets one percentage versus my gadgets and my gizmos, my doohickeys might get another percentages. So again, it gives us flexibility. And so when you're defining a rate table can have one or more rate dimensions, and those dimensions are either amounts, percents, expressions, or strings. And then I mentioned also, and I gave this in the example, we also support this concept of multidimensional rate tables, where maybe I have a tier of between revenue amounts between 0 and 250 and 250 and above, where the countries are US, Japan, and Germany, and the products might be selling either product X or service Y. And so we can create these really complex lookup tables. This is an example by looking at a 3-dimensional rate table right now. But what this does is it allows us to do very complex mathematics, all defined. You don't need to be an Excel jockey. You don't need to be a sysadmin. It's the ability of a business person to do very, very complex logic, all by leveraging this concept that we call multidimensional rate tables. So we've talked a little bit about expressions, and we've talked a little bit about rate tables, both single-dimensional rate tables as well as multidimensional rate tables. And what I want to do is I want to spend a couple minutes and talk a little bit about formulas and how we put formulas together. Now, the first thing to note is we talked a little bit about formulas when we were talking about the performance measure, right? The what, the how, and the how much. Inside there was something called the measure formula. And within the compensation plan itself, when we talk about the what, the how, and the how much, the how is also a formula, and that's called an incentive formula. And so let me talk first a little bit about the differences, and then I'll talk about the similarities. So the differences between the two are primarily for the purpose of why am I using the formula. The measure formula, the purpose of the measure formula is to calculate the attainment or your achievement level. How well am I performing against a certain activity, or how well am I performing against a certain event, and how is that being calculated? So that's to calculate the attainment. The incentive formula is used primarily to calculate the earnings. How much commission am I going to be paid? How much am I going to how much is the bonus amount going to be, etc.? What's actually going to be paid? So the measure, going back, I'm going to jump from top to bottom a little bit. So the measure is used to calculate the attainment or your achievement level, where the measure formula, where the incentive formula is used primarily to calculate the earning, how much is going to be paid. So that's how to think about when to use which one of those. Now, there's actually a lot of similarity between formulas. Now, we name the formulas differently. We call it a measure formula versus an incentive formula, not to confuse our end users, so that when they're referring to a component, referring to a piece, there's a discrete name for each of them. Similarly, how we process transactions, there's similarity in those, but we name them differently, again, to help delineate. And let me explain what I mean. So if you remember in the beginning of the session when we started talking about plan components, the first thing I said is when you're defining a plan component, you're going to decide how are you going to process transactions. Are you processing them individually, or are you going to group them? Or per event or per interval is what I think I said. And so per event was ask a question, get a piece of candy, ask a question, get a piece of candy, where per interval is ask a question, I'm going to put it on the side, your piece of candy, ask another question, put your piece of candy on the side, and at the end of the interval, whether it be a week or a month or a quarter, I'm going to dump the contents and evaluate how well you performed all at once. So at the measure level, we have this capability, and there's an option when you're building your formula, it says process transactions. And your choices are, am I going to process transactions individually, which is ask a question, get a piece of candy, or am I going to group them by interval? At the plan component incentive formula level, we're deciding, are we going to calculate per event, or are we going to calculate per interval? They serve the same function, but they have discretely different names. Again, hopefully not to confuse it, so that when you're talking about the component pieces, you can clearly articulate what you're talking about. When you're processing transactions individually at the measure formula level, there's another option that you're going to be able to select, and that's the option of a running total, and it's another checkbox. When you don't have running total selected, that means all transactions are going to be treated discretely as if the one before it had never happened. So for example, if I sell a transaction for $100,000, it'll calculate it and create a calculated result for me. And then let's say a few days later, I have another transaction for, say, $150,000. It would then take that $150 and just based on the merits of that own transaction, it would then calculate and pay that. That's without a running total. With a running total, so if I say yes to the running total, the first transaction would process the same. The $100,000 would calculate the $100,000. The second transaction for $150,000 would know that I've already sold $100,000. So even though the second transaction is $150,000, it'll know that my running total to date for that period is $250,000. So it measures along, and it's just an option that you have with the solution. Similarly, there are options at the incentive formula level. Specifically, there's an option that says true up. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple minutes when I'm actually going to work through a number of examples. And I think it's easier if I'll explain that as we illustrate it. But so the net of it is, within the world of formulas within incentive compensation and within a comp plan, there are two types of formulas. Measure formulas, which happen at the performance measure level, and those are used to calculate attainments or your achievement levels. And then incentive formulas that are at a higher level, at the plan component level, and those are ultimately used to calculate earnings or commissions or what's ultimately going to be paid. So in order to illustrate this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the exact same example over and over again, but what I'm going to use is I'm going to show the different variations. So the first variation I'm going to do, we're going to process transactions individually, and the running total flag is set to no. So processing individually and the running total is set to no. We're going to use the same rate table we've been using thus far, which is $0 to $10,000, $10,000 to $30,000, and $30,000 and above, and those are given corresponding rates of 5%, 10%, 15% respectively. So let's say in the green that we have a series of transactions that come in. There's a January transaction, a February, a March, and an April. So let's go chronologically and say January happens. So the January transaction comes in for $7,500. $7,500, I go to the rate table. I see that would be within the first tier because it's between $0 and $10,000. That would yield me a rate of 5%. And so I'm going to do $7,500 times 5%. And I'm going to be paid out $375. Let's say February rolls around. February is $12,500 is the transaction. I'm going to go to the rate table. I see that's in the second tier. The second tier is paid out at a rate of 10%, and that pays out at 10%. So it's $12,500 times 10%, which is now $1,250. The same for March with $11,000. I see in the tier that's at 10%. And then I'm paid out $1,100, and then the fourth of $5,000. I see $5,000 takes me to the first tier, and it's then going to yield me a result of $250 because 5,000 times 5% is $250. So this is processing transactions individually, and this is running total no. So the question is, well, what happens if we change the flag from running total to no? Let's say we change it to yes. And how is that going to work? We're going to use the exact same transaction. So the first transaction comes in, which is $7,500. This is the first transaction of the period, so there is no running total because this is the first one. $7,500, we go to the rate table. It's a 5% is the rate table result. And so we'll take the $7,500 times 5%, and that's $375. Hopefully that's fairly straightforward because it's exactly the same as the last one. The second transaction comes in for $12,500. Now we know that we've already sold $7,500 and now we've sold another $12,500. So in reality, the system knows that our running total is we're now at $20,000. So it's going to take the $20,000, run that through the rate table, see that's paid out at a rate of 10%. And then we're going to calculate the transaction, which is the $12,500 times 10%. And that's going to yield $1,250. We have a third transaction that comes in that's $11,000. But as part of the running total, the $11,000 is added to the $7,500 and the $12,500. So now the system knows there's a running total of $31,000. The $31,000 is fed to the rate table. It says, oh, you know what? Your attainment level brings you to the third tier. That's 15%. And so it's going to take that transaction's volume of, say, $11,000 and multiply that amount by 15% to yield $1,650. And then everything above that, so for example, the fourth transaction in April, we now know the total is $36,000. We know it's at the highest tier of 15%, and we're now going to pay that $5,000 at a rate of 15%, so it's now $750. So all that we've done, we're still processing transactions individually. All that we're doing now is we've just changed the flag of the running total, which was no. We've now changed it to yes. So let's add another level to this. And so calculating individually, running total equals yes. We're now going to true up. And this is something that I mentioned earlier, and this is where I'm going to describe this. So the idea of truing up is, let's say that you're a salesperson, and let's say that you are selling transactions at the $10,000 range. And for those, you're being paid out at a rate of 5%. But then let's say later you have additional transactions come in that are going to be paid out at a higher percent, let's say 10%. So not only do you want those new transactions paid out at the higher rate of 10%, but you also want to go back and find those transactions that were paid at a lower rate, and you want to true those up. So those transactions that were paid at a 5% rate earlier are now going to be paid out at a higher rate at 10%. That's the concept of truing someone up. So if we talk through this as a little bit of an example. So the first transaction comes in, $7,500. $7,500, we look it up at 5%, that's $375. The second transaction comes in, that's $12,500. Now we know the running total is $20,000, so we're going to find out that falls us into the second tier, which is a 10% rate. But what we're going to do is we're saying everything should be paid now because we're truing it up. Everything, even things we paid in the past, should be paid at the higher rate. So we're taking basically the $20,000, the running total, and multiplying that by the 10%, which should technically equal $2,000. However, the system is smart enough to know we already paid the first transaction at 5% for $375. So that's already been paid out. So the system knows to take that out. So it's truing it up. And so the total payment for February is now going to be $1,625, which is the 10% of the $12,500, as well as another 5% for the $7,500. And you'll note here, this $1,625 plus the $375 does total $2,000. The third transaction comes in March. March brings us to a running total of $31,000. So now everything should be paid at 15%. So we're taking that whole, so what it's essentially doing is it's taking that whole value times 15%. What it should yield is it should yield $4,650. But the system knows that we've already paid $2,000. We paid $375 in month 1. We paid $1,625 in month 2, and that totals $2,000. So the system would be paying $4,650 if everything was paid at 15%, but we've already paid part of it in months 1 and months 2. So the delta for that is the $2,650. And so that's that we've trued it up. So now everything we've paid to date is now being paid out at a rate of 15%. Then in month 4 is April. Month 4, because we're doing an interval equals quarter, we're starting the interval from scratch again, or the attainment level from scratch. And so we take that $5,000 and find that first level, and it's paid at 5%, and that's $250. The thing to know about incentive compensation, and I should say this is an analogy I give to a lot of our customers sometimes, is imagine that you wanted to hire a handyman or a contractor to do some work at your home. If they showed up and the only tool that they showed up with was a hammer, then every problem you would tell them about would look like a nail. But when you're going to hire a contractor, you want a contractor that's going to come in your house and you're going to be able to tell them that the kitchen faucet is leaking and the front door is squeaking when I close it, and maybe my hardwood floors are creaking. And so they would have a red box, and they would open up that box, and they would pull out the appropriate tool for the job that you're asking them to fix. Incentive compensation is very similar to this, that it is not your responsibility as a consultant or as an implementer that you have to decide what the rules should be. The customer is going to dictate to you, these are our scenarios. And what I'm trying to articulate to you through this session is these are some of the tools that you can select from in order to find the appropriate tool for the job at hand. And so whether you're checking the check boxes of running totals or true ups or the things we're going to talk about in a couple minutes, for you to know that this is just part of your arsenal. These are tools of which you can select from, and it's based on your discretion and your best judgment which tools you're going to invoke at any point in time. Hope that makes sense. So again, we've processed transactions individually. Both running total is no as well as a running total is yes. And then we're also truing up in this last example. The other thing to note is that for customers to do this manually, whether it be in Excel or in a legacy system, they would have to know ahead of time and do a lot of programming and a lot of if-then-else statements and what have you. And there's a lot of legwork they would have to do up front. With Oracle, these are just check boxes. And when you check off the selections that you want, the system automatically understands what that logic is, and it's going to do all these types of calculations for you. So we've talked about processing transactions individually. Let's give an example of processing transactions that are grouped by. So again, this is ask a question. I'm going to put it aside for you. Ask a question, put it on the side for you. Only at the end of the interval, I'm going to do something with it. So again, we're processing and the interval is quarter. And so we have the same transactions that are coming in. The January transaction for $75, the February transaction for $12,500, and then the March transaction for $11,000. So each of those transactions have been put on the side or been put on in a bucket. And then on the last day of the quarter, so on March 31st, it's going to dump the contents and it's going to do something with them. And I talked earlier, we might count them, you might sum them, you might want to find the standard deviation, you might want to do different types of complex mathematics. In this example, we're just going to sum it. We'll talk about different variations in a later module when we talk about advanced calculations and expressions. But in this example, so the system is smart enough because you've defined when you've implemented what a week is and what a month is and what a quarter is, and whether they're on calendar fiscal years or they're their own fiscal years similar to what Oracle has. You've defined all that and they know what the last day of the interval is. And so in this example, on May 31st, it's going to dump the contents from January, February, and March. It's going to, in this example, sum them. So we're taking the 31,000. We're seeing on the rate table that 31,000 is at a rate of 10%. Oh, excuse me, that 31,000 brings us to the third tier of 15%. And we're going to take 31,000 times 15% and pay the total of the 4,650 as a lump sum payment to be calculated on March 31st. Again, these are tools. You're a handyman or a carpenter, and these are the tools of which you can select from. I'm just trying to explain how the system natively works when you select some of these options. So let's talk a little bit about different ways that we're able to split through the rate tables. So the first option is something that we call no split, right? And no split is exactly what it sounds like it's going to be, which is I might have transactions of $50,000 or $100,000 or $200,000, and no matter what the value is, it's going to be a flat rate. So I'm always getting 5% for a certain type of transaction, or I'm always going to set percentage rate based on no matter what the amount is. That's what we call no split. Then when we start splitting, there's actually a number of different options we have. There's something that we call a fixed split or a non-proportional split. And what this says is, in this example, look, for the first $50,000, you're going to be paid out at a rate of 3%. And then from $50,000 to $150,000, you're going to be paid out at a rate of 5%. And then anything above that might be paid out at a rate of, say, 10%. So these are a stepped tier, right? So you're doing a fixed step across that says you hit one threshold. Once you hit that threshold, then it goes to the next threshold, and then on and on. Another type of split that we do commonly is something not as common as a fixed split or a non-proportional, but is something, again, as part of your toolkit, having something that's an option for you, is something that's called a proportional split. And what the proportional split allows us to do is it's not as convenient as a step. It's an interpolation that per percentage point as it's growing, there's a slope here. So it's increasing to a slope up until it looks like $100,000. Then at $100,000, there's an inflection point, and then there's a steeper slope. And so the price per dollar or the percentage per dollar grows, the slope increases up into, say, 150,000. And then it doesn't plateau in this example at 150,000, but it does. It is less steep as it climbs additionally. So again, let me go back a second. Where non-proportional is a fixed step, you hit this rate, and then anything in this next range is all paid out at the 5% as an example. When you get to the proportional splits, it's interpolating per percentage point or per dollar. It's incrementally increasing, and then there's always inflection points, and then the slope will typically change from one inflection point to the next. A fourth type of splits that we've done, and this is more of a strategy of how to handle these, is the idea of nonlinear and exponential growth. And there are ways, and we talk through this, particularly in our advanced deep dive classes, we go through ways that you can set these up in the system. But there's the net of this is that the ability to split through rate tables, there's obviously is a requirement. And then the way that you split through it, there's a lot of different options. Are you splitting in steps? Are you splitting through fixed slopes? Are you leveraging curves? Are you doing no splits at all? And again, it's one of those things that as part of your toolkit, these are options that when you need them, they're very, very handy for you to be able to leverage. So let's do another working example. And let's say we have a transaction. Let's say we have a rate table, 0 to 250,000, 250 to 500,000, 500,000 to $1 million, and $1 million and up. They're paid out at a rate of 4%, 5%, 5.5, and 7%. And let's pretend we have one transaction that comes in, and that one transaction is for $400,000. So this first example we're going to do is a no split. And in a no split, take the transaction amount of $400,000. I find where does it fall within the table. So it falls in the second tier, and it's a 5%. And so I'm going to take that $400,000, I'm going to multiply it by 5%, and so that's going to yield me a payment of, say, $20,000. That's taking a $400,000 transaction and leveraging something we call no split. If we take it a step further and we leverage the fixed or the non-proportional example, and we use those words interchangeably. It's also known as a step rate. So let's leverage the step rate or the fixed rate, and let's say the transaction amount comes in at $400,000. And that $400,000, well, first of all, the first question is, well, does it exceed the first tier? And the answer is yes, because the first tier is 0 to 250,000 and the transaction amount is 400,000. So that first tier is paid out at a rate of 4%. So we're taking that $250,000, we're multiplying it by 4%, and that's going to yield us $10,000. Then we take the remainder of that tier, which is 400,000 minus 250,000. So there's another 150,000, which is in the second tier at 5%. So we take that $150,000 right here, we multiply that by 5%, and that second tier is paid out at a rate of $7,500. And that yields us a total of $17,500. And again, this is just by selecting the split type of fixed split or a non-proportional split. The third example that we're going to use is what we call proportional. And let's talk a little bit about this. So what a proportional split is, so again, the exact same rate table and the exact same transaction amount. And so the first question is, of the 400,000, does it meet or exceed the first threshold? And it exceeds it because the first threshold between 0 and 250,000 is only 250,000. So we're going to take that $250,000 and we're going to say, how far did it make it into it? And it made it all 250,000 out of a possible range of 250,000, which is going to yield 250,000 divided by 250,000 is going to be 1. And just remember that, and I'll tell you why that's important in a second. So we take this $250,000 times basically 1 times 4%, and that yields us $10,000. We then take the second tier, which we know the second range of the 400,000, there's going to be 150,000. So the second question is, in between $250,000 and $500,000 in the tier, how many individual dollars separate 250,000 and 500,000? And the answer is 250,000, right? Because it's 500,000 minus 250,000 is 250,000. So that's how many individual dollars are in that tier. Now the question is, how many of those dollars did they make their way into? And well, we know that there was excess of 150. So they made $150,000 into a total pool of $250,000. And so $150,000 divided by $250,000 is really, they got 60% of the way into that. And so this is for people that when I teach this class live, a lot of people are scratching their heads. So hopefully we're okay. So the question is, how far did I get into the tier, which is 150,000, divided by how big is that total tier, which is 250,000, and that 100,000 divided by 250,000 says that I got 60% of the tier. So I take the the remaining transaction amount of 150,000, I multiply that by 0.6, and then I multiply that by 5%, and that yields me $4,500. Again, part of your toolkit. This is very infrequent when these do happen, but when they do happen, you absolutely are going to be super happy that this is a tool in your toolkit. So the question is, well, why would a customer do a no split versus a non-proportional versus a proportional? And one of the things is, well, it might be their business justification. But two is, look at the impact. So we're using the exact same rate table and the exact same amount of transaction amount of $400,000. And if we go back a little bit, I'm going back, and let's say the no split yielded, for a $400,000 transaction, the no split yields a payment of $20,000. If we do the fixed, it yields $17,500. And then if we do the proportional rate, it yields $14,500. The exact same transaction, the exact same rate table. The only thing we're doing is we're evaluating the rate table differently based on how we are splitting through the tiers. One of the tools in your toolkit, and this is certainly an option for you. And so with that said, that concludes the basic fundamentals of compensation plans. And so what we've done is we've talked that all that a compensation plan is, it's an umbrella. It's an umbrella of these things that we call plan components. And then within a plan component, in order to build that or any compensation rule in the system, you have to answer 3 questions: the what, the how, and the how much. What was the eligible event or activity that's going to trigger something to happen? How is the math calculated, and how much or at what rate or what rate table am I going to pay someone? And when you can answer those questions, you can really build anything in the system.